Welcome to Coach Garrett's Exercise Library. Braced crunch. The focus of this crunch is a little bit different than standard crunches. We're thinking about really engaging here, and rather than trying to get maximum flexion through the spine, thinking about stretching out long through the top of the head, keeping neck in line with the rest of the spine, squeezing in to just slightly lift. So it's more of a slight lift while extending versus this sort of squeezing in and tucking the chin to the chest and wrenching on the spine that way. Penguin crunches, similar to the braced crunch. I'm thinking about squeezing up slightly, keeping everything long, tailbone out to the top of the head with this round brace through the center, and reaching pinky towards heel on one side and then the other. This doesn't have to be extreme, and I'm definitely not crunching through the spine and then trying to rotate. Adding that flexion and that side-to-side movement is putting a lot more pressure on the spine, so we're just thinking about lengthening and getting that slight oblique engagement. Touchdown jacks. Scaling options, standing wide, reaching down between the feet. I'm getting some decent hinge through my hips and pressing my knees out. Notice I'm neither touching down nor does it look like I'm doing a jack. From the side, similar wide stance, reaching down to the space directly between my feet. If I have the range of motion to actually touch down with neutral spine, that's a great way to progress. We could also do some sort of touchdown, step in, step out stuff. Trying not to get a lot of rotation here, and rather just thinking like this slight rotational effect of reaching one arm down and then the other versus like big twists. Full out, it's going to be reaching down, hop in, hop out, stringing that together for intensity as is controllable. B stance squat. So our B stance squat, we're going to start in something that's like our regular stance squat. One foot's going to go back and heel's going to come up. What this does is it forces our front leg to do more of the work. So from there, we want this front leg to behave very much like it does in a regular squat. So we want the toes or the knee to track out towards the center of the foot and stay out enough that we're not collapsing in, but we're not pressing too far out. We also want the hips to stay relatively level, similar to that regular stance squat. Heel up in the back. May allow for a slightly more vertical squat because I'm actually giving myself some support back. So my shin in front may be able to stay a little bit more vertical versus having to hinge or move the knee really far forward. So it may actually allow slightly more depth. I'm also having to work a little bit harder to stabilize this leg. We could do a back squat variation, a goblet squat variation, or an air variation. Some people cue this with really turning that back foot out. I think that's a fine option, as we're not trying to stabilize this back leg very much. You can kind of do whatever you want, and the intention is to have the heel up on this variation. Staggered stance squat. So a staggered stance squat is very different from a B stance squat in that, again, starting from my basic squat stance, I'm moving one foot forward some amount. So I just moved this foot forward about half a foot length. But my intention here is to keep balanced weight, big toe, little toe, heel. So I'm keeping both both heels glued to the floor. Everything else is the same. I'm still reaching my hips back, still pressing my knees out, trying to keep my knees tracking towards the center of each foot, keeping my spine neutral. Tendency is to want to bring that heel up that's further back. So we actually have to work pretty hard to balance the weight, big toe, little toe, heel in both feet. This is teaching our hips to stabilize in slightly irregular positions. I could take this slightly further by taking one foot an entire foot length forward. This is going to affect my ability to stabilize, especially this back hip. This back knee wants to collapse in. I'm just going to go to the depth that I can control and keep that weight balance, big toe, little toe, and then back up. So it will affect the depth of people's squat, and they will tend to want to allow that back heel to come up, like so, or allow that back knee to collapse in a bit. We're going to try our best to not do either of those things and just go to the depth that we can go to, and squeezing into that slight instability and that slight challenge range of motion wise will help people develop more robust stability through that hip. That is the staggered stance squat versus the B stand squat. Dumbbell hamstring curl. All right, so these ones may be a little tough to get into. We could do this on a bench or a box. I'm trying to get the dumbbell between my feet and squeeze up here for a curl. Not ideal. Jesus Christ. I'm gonna have to cut this one out. So we may want some help to get here. I have the dumbbell right between my feet. I'm focused on a slow extension of the knee, squeeze out. Notice I have my knees off the edge of the box. That may or may not be appropriate for everyone. So we could have the knees actually up on the box and be more like this, which is going to be a little bit easier on a bench that's longer. That's going to give the knees a little bit more support potentially. So slowly lowering to that extension and then squeezing back up. Again, it might be nice to have some help in and out of this one. We definitely don't want people to hyperextend their knees, so probably erring on the side of a lighter weight for that dumbbell hamstring curl on a box or a bench. Dumbbell knee extension, similar to the dumbbell hamstring curl. I'm sitting on a box, just trying to squeeze my quads to extend at the knees, come back down. Could do this on a bench, might limit the range of motion slightly. And again, I'm thinking of a big squeeze pause and a slow lower. Dumbbell knee extension, pretty easy to get into this one. Again, a box might offer more correct height than a bench. Concentration curls. There's a number of different ways to do a concentration curl. If you look it up online, people tend to be seated. The main through line is elbow touching inside of leg. That's going to keep the elbow still in space while we do this curl. It is a really potent way to activate just the biceps. So 3 variations that I like are bottom of squat. As long as people can maintain a strong bottom of squat, then this knee elbow contact here is forcing the issue of the concentration curl. If people do have hypermobile elbows, you might want to steer them away from this. People often ask, is it a hammer curl? Am I coming across like this? I would say palm out is going to make a fuller range of motion, squeezing up to the shoulder versus kind of this across the chest way. Hammer curl is also perfectly acceptable. For people who cannot hold the bottom of a squat, half kneeling variations work. So I can brace here, I can brace on a box or something similar. And again, for people with hypermobile elbows, we can think about having that shoulder shifted slightly forward. So I really would have to work to get past neutral with the elbow, versus if my shoulder is back here, it's like forcing it past neutral. So just some things to think about for anyone who does have hypermobile elbows. Another variation, of course, is that seated variation. Or we could do these standing and skip the concentration part, or it could be a slightly more bent over version of that squat. Concentration curls. Bent over reverse fly. So there's a couple different ways to do this. Pretty much we want to start from standing all the time. If people pick up their weights and then try to straighten their back from here, they're going to be less successful than if they stand all the way up, set their core, and then good morning or RDL down. Thinking hands at or below knees is ideal. If people are even just slightly above the knees, their back is at this angle, and that's going to put a lot more of the work in this upper back trap area versus sort of the more center of the upper back. I'm thinking squeezing shoulder blades together and then having arms come wide out to the side. Ideally, the weight is light enough that people can pause in this position and control the neutral, or the negative, I mean. If people do have to throw it up, That's okay. I think it's not optimal for stability. If people are letting their shoulders kind of dive forward, then probably a lighter weight. So we're thinking about that squeeze of the upper back first, and then wherever the arms get to is fine. Unweighted usually works pretty well. And we could also do this like palms up and back variation. That usually works pretty well and is going to focus on just slightly lower parts of the upper back. So probably light dumbbells or light plates for either of these. Thinking about that back somewhat parallel to the floor. Good variation of that for people who don't want to be in that bent over position is a banded variation. Where we're like palms up, squeezing out. Palms don't have to be up. Any variation here is fine. Again, as long as we're not allowing that shoulder to come forward, but rather are thinking about activation of the upper back, and then the arms go where the arms go. PVC overhead back traction. This is a great sort of warm-up and mobility move. PVC overhead back traction. It's also going to get at the glutes as well as the shoulders. So using the PVC, you could also very easily use rings or a post for this. I'm going to make a little tripod end of the PVC in my feet, and then I'm shifting my hips back, pressing chest through shoulders. From here, I can just focus on that overhead position similar to how I might in a down dog. I can also bend one knee and press the opposite hip out a little bit. That's going to get some glute stretch and just variations of how wide the stance is are going to help feel some stretch in some different places. From the front, it's going to look sort of like this, just playing around, and I can put the end of the PVC further away or closer depending on how much traction I want to feel through the hips and back. Overhead stretch, glute stretch, etc. PVC front rack or external rotation stretch. This is one we do a lot in preparation for front rack stuff. PVC is in the hand. We're sending it back over the same side shoulder. A lot of times people want to come around here. It's just here, straight back. Then the other thing we want to do is grab it from behind. That's something else. We're actually grabbing it in front. So this is the place where a lot of people have trouble. So it's straight back and we're reaching across the front of the body to get it. If people can't reach it, they could use a box to force it forward. Sometimes you can get it with your own leg, and that can be helpful. So from here, we have a lot of things we can do. Coming right to the center of the bicep can be one good cue. Keeping a full grip on the PVC can be another good cue. Being able to pull your hand down towards the shoulder is a useful aspect. Being able to wind up the grip. So I'm using rotation here to wind my grip up at the top. That can be useful. And then as we swing the PVC across, it's externally rotating our shoulder. It's as though our hand at the top is going down to find the barbell as it would in a front rack with a barbell. So we can just turn this on and off. My personal favorite thing to do is this. Get the elbow pointed parallel or even with the shoulder. Not straight forward, not straight out, but halfway in between. That's a really strong front rack position. Get medium stretch and then push against the PVC with this top arm, winding up the muscles I'm going to try to release. Tension, deep breath in, hold for 4, 3, 2, 1, then long, so exhale, releasing all that tension. This is classic contract, relax, and breathe stuff, and then trying to extend that stretch slightly. Oh yeah, like a newborn baby. I might do that 2 or 3 times on each side. So again, the setup is straight up, straight back, reach across, help yourself if you need to. PVC front rack stretch. Rodeo arm circles. This is another nice front rack warm-up. So again, my shoulder is in neutral, my elbow is not straight out or straight forward, splitting the difference. I'm taking my forearm and making sort of a cone or circles. This back corner is where there's some resistance. So I'm actively pressing into this external rotation of the shoulder, which is going to be similar to front rack with the barbell stuff. I can switch directions. At some point, people are going to want to do this or something, that's more just the wrist. We're trying to get the whole forearm to make like a cone. And we're also thinking a little bit engagement of the upper back so that we're not like super far forward or like doing it out here, but rather shoulder is closer to neutral and we're squeezing into that back corner. Stick of truth squats. This is the stick of truth, formerly known as the lie detector. What we are doing with this is getting it connected to our back. So right at the tailbone, right between the shoulder blades, back of head. People have differently sized glutes and different shapes to their back. So this is not about finding something that is absolute perfection. It's just about giving us some feedback. So I can hold this with a hand. I could also tie a band around myself and hold it that way. Sometimes getting the band on first is helpful, and then you just slide it in. Either way, from this position, we could do a squat or a good morning. So stick of truth, squat, is just this, thinking about bracing at the top, being really nice and neutral through the back, and then that neutral stays with us all the way down, all the way back up. Things that happen are people push their arch through the back immediately, and that's going to cause our stick of truth to come off the shoulder blades or like slide off the side of the head like so. Other things that happen are at the top we squeeze past neutral. Again, the stick of truth lets us know that that's happening. Also at the bottom, sometimes we might round at the bottom, and again, the stick of truth will come off the head or the tailbone or both versus keeping in contact. Stick of truth, good morning, or deadlift or RDL, very similar to the stick of truth squat. Bracing at the top, setting the hips back, trying to keep spine neutral through that hip hinge range of motion. Again, things that might happen is tucking tailbone under at the top, arching back to initiate, or rounding the spine to get the shoulders lower while sacrificing that neutral spine. Stick of truth. Don't lie to me. Kang squat. Named after a Chinese weightlifting coach. Apparently, Kang squat. We're going to do a good morning in our squat stance. Find strong depth to our good morning, and then squeeze hips down into our squat bottom. Hips come back up to the bottom of the good morning, and then we squeeze back up, trying to retain spinal neutral throughout, trying to retain braced core throughout. Hamstring stretch, hips, ankles, bottom of squat, stretch. Good morning, standing. Don't finish like I just did. B stance deadlift. Our B stance deadlift is very similar to our B stance squat. I don't know that anyone would want to do a B stance sumo deadlift, so probably we're talking about conventional deadlift, feet about hip distance apart, pointing more or less forward, heel up in the back, and then we're just going through our deadlift or RDL stuff. Again, that kickstand is going to allow our shin to remain much more vertical. It's also going to force a little bit more stability requirement from this foot forward hip. So we want everything to be the same. We don't want to have this be collapsing across, although it might, because people might be bad at this at first, which is why it's such a good exercise to use. Very, very similar to our single leg Romanian deadlift, except that we're not forcing ourselves to float that back leg. So most likely people can go a little bit heavier on this, forcing a lot more of the strength to come from this single grounded leg than standard deadlift. Lateral step up or step down. I really like a lateral step up or step down to train glute activation in functional compound movement. Easiest variation here is on something very low. I'm putting my feet pretty close together and pretty close next to each other, so I'm not standing way back here. I'm also not way out here. You can see I just am on a 45-pound plate. I can easily squeeze straight up and straight down, letting this knee come forward as I do so. However, I'm trying to cue this hip hinge so that I could float this foot off and hold it at a millimeter off the floor all day if I had to. This is training that single leg stability, so not collapsing out to the side, not collapsing across the front, just enough external rotation and abduction to keep that knee in a strong, stable spot, weight balanced in the center of the foot, floating that foot slowly off the floor all the way to standing. The finished position is standing on one foot. So as opposed to this straight up and down, where it becomes very, very hard to float that foot a millimeter off the floor, this hip hinge variation is going to really allow me to engage glutes a lot more. So we can stack up weights for that. So a step up would be squeezing up. I like a nice strong tempo negative, so maybe it's squeezing up and then slowly lowering to a heel tap. The heel tap is going to help keep people from powering off with the calf. We can take this much, much higher into even something that's sort of like a box pistol, where from here, there's no way, if I try to press myself straight up, I'm just gonna shoot myself back. There's no way I can float that heel off the floor. So the higher you go, the more likely it is that it's going to help people figure out how to engage the glutes and load that foot, this higher foot, with the posterior chain. So squeezing back, hinge, squeezing up. Same thing on the way down. Have to do that pretty big hinge to allow myself to have the strength and control to come down for a heel tap and do reps. This is like an extreme height. We might be thinking about a 45 and a 25 or two 45s, or this box tipped on its side to progress up to a height that is challenging. Bent press. Here is the bent press. It's a lot like a windmill. So here, our kettlebell windmill, we would have one hand up with the kettlebell, one foot pointing out, one foot pointing forward. We're thinking about pressing the hips back into the side, sliding this hand down, knees can bend, looking up at my kettlebell, maybe taking this hand to the floor, squeezing up. The difference with the bench press is that I'm in a front rack position, and as I go into that windmill, I'm squeezing that weight up into my frontal plane, so out to the side, activating lats and upper back to get this elbow pinned in. From there, the kettlebell or dumbbell or whatever I'm using is going to stay relatively still in space, and I'm moving away from it. So we can bend our knees and hinge as much as we want, trying to get our arm fully locked out, and from here, we're pressing back up to come to an overhead position, catching back in that front rack for reps. With a dumbbell, it's going to look something like this. Sending hips away, engaging lats, getting elbow, forearm, and weight into my frontal plane, bending knees as I need to, lowering myself away from the weight, and lowering until I'm in this pressed out, locked out position. Eyes can be up on my weight, and then pressing back up to find the overhead position. Switching sides would be just changing the positions of my feet. Again, pressing hips away, focusing on spinal neutral here throughout, bending the knees as much as I need to so that the weight is staying still in space. I'm moving away from the weight, and then I'm using my anti-hinge to get that weight up towards the overhead position. The Turkish get-up. There's nothing that says we have to use a kettlebell for a Turkish get-up. We can use a kettlebell, a dumbbell, a barbell, etc. Couple quick things about the Turkish get-up. We're thinking about shoulder stability a lot. So thinking about the intention of being externally or internally rotated at the shoulder helps. Anytime the arm is out front, we're thinking external rotation, so thumb sort of straight up or out. Anytime we're behind the arm or behind the body, we're thinking some amount of internal rotation, so that shoulder coming up and forward will actually help us to stabilize a little bit. That can be helpful in that oftentimes in this, we have an arm down and an arm up, and we're always thinking shoulders sort of away from the ears if possible, but it's okay to think we're actually a little stronger in this external rotation, so we can actually cheat ourselves a little bit by keeping chest open towards the floor through some of this. As we go back, or as we are forced into this deep overhead or out to the side, we can think some of that internal rotation can actually help stabilize. Just some quick thoughts. My main point of form for the Turkish getup is that I want my feet to be wide. So starting with narrow feet is going to give us very little to do. If I push, I'm almost pushing myself straight up. And I want the feet to be wide, similar to our bench press position, where when I take my 1 foot long, this foot is outside of the plane of the body, so I have a lot of strength to press myself into this initial roll. On this side, it's like this. The wider my feet are, the more my base of stability is through my legs. So I'm doing essentially floor press, rolling onto the side, and then I'm going to have to use some cantilevering with that weight to press up onto elbow, onto hand. So this is one of the places where the shoulder can be sort of weak here. I can internally rotate and allow the shoulder to come up. And I'm thinking of actually slightly externally rotating and pulling the shoulder down away from the ear to be really strong. So some of this is maybe a little bit of just thinking about position of the hand and what feels right to the individual. From here, so the other thing I like to think about is where my feet start off pointing is where I'm going to end up looking. That can be a good cue. So right now I'm looking across the room at this post over here. That's where I'm going to end up looking at the end. So foot up, other arm on that same side is doing the press, roll, cantilever, elbow, hand. From here, some people do a really high bridge. I think whatever works for people. If this is really drawn in, they might need a higher bridge to get that foot under. This is where sometimes people get caught up. If this is out a little bit more, it might allow people to sort of sneak under a little bit. And this is a place where people are like, am I going this way? Am I going this way? That's where that thing I looked at the beginning is telling me where I'm going. And then I think it's good to just let people know this is the bottom of an overhead lunge. So we're not trying to get up from here or here. We're trying to arrange ourselves so we're in the bottom of an overhead lunge looking at the thing that we're looking at to begin with. That's familiar. So everything's the same on the way back. Step back, overhead lunge. And now things start to get less familiar, where I'm thinking about getting my hand to come down so that I can be stacked here, so this foot shifts out of the way. Again, this is a place where we can get caught, so people might need more of a bridge, or actually need to scooch this foot out a little bit. Hip, elbow, and then this is a place where it's easy to lose control. And again, this foot being out to the side gives me a wider base of support. So I can come down into this roll position and have some pressure on this foot, and then slowly roll myself back down. In summation, look where your feet are pointed at the beginning. That can help sort of in that middle transition. Have wide feet to start. That's going to give you more support for this roll. And then thinking about maybe doing some subtle changes with both your hand and the position of your shoulders to find strong positions throughout that Turkish getup. The palaf, or banded palaf. So we have a band. It's about chest height. I'm not going to change this one completely. We can do this standing, where the idea is I'm putting some energy, some stretch on this band, where when my levers are short, it's not putting that much rotational pressure on my body. As I lengthen my lever, the band really wants me to do this, so I'm just resisting that. So this turns that rotational energy up, this calms it down. So from the side, see I'm squeezed across, squeezing out, not allowing the band to rotate me, coming back. So reps are just going to look like this. Turning it on, turning it off. You can get further or closer to your anchor to intensify that, as well as using different size bands. Standing works well. Oftentimes, I'll instruct these half kneeling. That just sort of takes some of the leg energy out of it. And again, squeezing, hands to the center of the body, squeezing straight out. Again, that turns up the leverage on the band, making me want to rotate, and so I just have to resist that. Half kneeling, probably this lower knee is the one closer. Switching sides to do the other side. Banded adduction leg lower. So, band is probably going to want to be about as high as my knee here in this bent knee position. I'm getting the band around the center of this foot, and then I'm going to do some leg lower. So I'm up here. Ideally, the band is pulling off to the side, so I'm having to stabilize by squeezing into the center line, lowering, lifting. I can keep this foot up. Arms are out at a T to stabilize, so again, I'm having to work throughout this range of motion to keep the band from pulling my leg laterally. So hugging my center line with this foot, all the way down, all the way up. I'm using a light red band, possibly an even lighter orange band would be more appropriate, and then you could be further away, which would keep the angle of the pull more consistent. Hollow hang. So this is an expression of that hollow body with an overhead component. So this is should be the start of most of our pull-up type things, hanging knee raise. So a really great way to scale this is to put things in front of us that allow us to support ourselves. So this is just about the right height that I can put my toes together and still be supporting myself. And I'm thinking mostly about taking this curve out of my low back and neutralizing the pelvis. So if I do nothing, my pelvis is going to hang and it's going to open me up here. So I'm just thinking about that. Pointing the toes and touching them together out front slightly can help engage some of that front of the body stuff. So having a couple plates here so that people can support some of their weight while having their toes out front and working on that front of body activation. Pelvic neutral is ideal. If people can just jump up into a nice strong hollow hang position, great. Do that all day, but a lot of people can't do that, so having something where they can point their toes out front is a great way to scale. Scaled hanging knee raise, similar to a scaled hollow hang. Having something out front where I can get into this hollow hang position and do a knee raise that way. My goal here is consistency of pelvis position, so avoiding hanging the hips back as I do this knee raise. So giving myself plates or something out here as needed to be able to maintain this hollow position is a great way to scale the hanging knee raise. It's not going to be a kipping hanging knee raise. In that way, it's going to be more consistent hanging knee raise. I can edit this out later if you want to come through exercise library. And in fact, this might just feature.
I'm going to make my videos up here now.
What's that?
I'm going to make my videos up here now.
Okay, I'm almost done.
I'll just do the scroll right now.
Cool. Pull up negative with hold. So, for the most part, people are going to be doing assisted pull-up negatives. I like to do this with a bar on the rack. I then can use as much support from my legs as I want. Having my feet right under me can be problematic in that as I lower straight down, I end up in this sort of squat position where I might get pushed out. So probably thinking about taking the feet just slightly forward. This puts me in an ideal top of pull-up position versus sort of being all crunched up at the top. So hands just outside of shoulders, elbows under wrists, stepping forward as much as we need. I can imagine lifting my feet without actually moving, and that's just going to force more and more shoulder stability here. Holding at the top for as long as we want, and then the nice slow negative, ideally going straight down to full overhead extension, and then assisting as needed to come back up. If people can jump up, hollow hang, do a nice straight pull up and hold at the top, great. But if they're starting to get rounded or whatever, doing this variation or assisting themselves up to that start position, at least with a box, and then they might hang unassisted and do an unassisted negative, but I think it's very unlikely for most people to be able to do a strict pull-up or even a kipping pull-up and get into a really strong position at the top. So having some assistance with a box or the floor to start, I think ends in better quality. Ring bicep curls. So this is kind of TRX style stuff. The further away our feet are from the anchor, the easier it is. So up here, to do a ring bicep curl is almost, does almost nothing. I actually almost fall forward. So I have to walk myself a little bit forward, similar to a ring row, except in this case, I'm gonna go palms up and bring my pinkies toward my temples, focusing just on the bicep curl aspect of this. Probably nice to go lower and avoiding any kind of hinging or arching through the hips and back. So really strong, strict core position, ring bicep curl. Ring tricep press. Again, the closer my feet are to right under my shoulders, the easier this is going to be. So walking my feet back towards the anchor is going to be more challenging. In this case, it's going to get harder as I go down, trying to bring the rings to my temples and then squeeze back up. Because it gets harder as I go into it, it might work better to have a staggered stance. That way I can control myself here if it gets too hard and have somewhere to go. I can also assist myself with this front leg. Trying to keep elbows still in space relative to my body. So again, just bringing the rings towards temples and then pressing out versus like something like this or like this where the elbows come up or down. Ring fly. So opening out to a T allows my shoulders to squeeze together. In this one, probably makes sense to have 1 foot forward. I can take as much weight off of here as I need to get a challenge. Opening up slowly and then squeezing back. If I squeeze hands all the way back together, it might force me to take this foot up. So I could stop here. Mostly I'm interested in this resisted stretch through the chest and then squeezing out of that stretch. Ring fly. Ring reverse fly. From this hanging position, I'm squeezing shoulder blades together, bringing arms wide, coming up close to standing, and then coming back to the plank again, avoiding hip, dip, or back arching. I can also do this staggered stance here to assist myself up to that big squeeze at the top. Slowly lowering, squeeze, lowering. And for most of these ring things, having the rings a little lower than normal might be nice. So bottoms of the rings at or slightly below the knees will make it a little bit easier to access those movements.